Yeah. I'm going to good? Okay. Just catch me before I go. All right, friends, Earth and space explorers, lend me your ears. It is our privilege and honor to be joined today by Professor Mathieu Lapôtre from Stanford University. Mathieu leads the Earth and Planetary Surface Processes group at Stanford. A bit about his background before we dive into his talk. He has a Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Strasbourg. He has not one, but 3 master's degrees, I believe, and a PhD in geology from Caltech. So after getting his PhD, he was a John Harvard Distinguished Fellow at Harvard University as a postdoc, and then moved to Stanford to start his faculty position. So in the course of his career, he's really a rising star in the area, if you haven't noticed. And he's received several major awards. First of all, he got to go to graduate school with me. It's also other things like a Kavli Fellow, and won the Leopold Early Career Award from American Geophysical Union, and was also the Sharp lecturer for AGU. So I expect a great presentation, a great colloquium. So Mathieu, I'll turn it over to you to fulfill, if not exceed, those expectations. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
All right. Well, thanks, Joe. No pressure. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Joe, for the invitation. This is my first time visiting ASU. I was very excited to come here, and it's definitely lived up to my expectations and more. It's been awesome chatting with you all. So I'm very excited to be telling you today about how comparative planetology can help us to decipher the record of surface processes through a better understanding of their mechanics. And I will do so by illustrating this point with a few examples drawn from my group's research over the past few years. Let's see if this works. There we go. So an old paradigm in the geosciences states that the present is the key to the past. And I'm sure that most of you in this room have heard this phrase before. And it means that we can understand what Earth was like in the past by inspection of modern geological processes on Earth today. Now, a somewhat newer paradigm has been to acknowledge that geological processes need not be constant or uniform, and to use the physics of these processes to instead derive it from observations of modern Earth, to think about how these processes might have changed through time or varied through space to better interpret the geological records of Earth's past and of other planets. Now, an even newer paradigm, which is really only now kind of emerging, is to in turn make use of the geological processes occurring on other planets to better understand the physics behind them, and in doing so, to better understand the geological record of our own planet, the Earth, its past, and its future. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll illustrate this point through 3 examples drawn, again, from my group's research. And in my first example, I will take you to Saturn's moon, Titan. Now, this picture looks especially pixelated on the screen because it's huge, but it's also because the data is very coarse. And I will tell you about how models for the formation of ooids on Earth, now I'll get back to what ooids are in a minute, might have provided the key to understanding the global sedimentary cycle on Saturn's moon, Titan. And this work was born from a collaboration with Mike Malaska, Morgan Cable at JPL, and is being continued now with one of my grad students, Colin Marvin, and Jenny Rodabaugh at BYU. So thanks to Cassini, Titan is now well known to be a sedimentary world with lakes and seas concentrated at high latitudes. There is abundant evidence for alluvial and fluvial environments. In light blue here, you can see everywhere a fluvial valley was mapped, which you might see is essentially following linear paths. Those are just Cassini swaths. So everywhere we had high enough resolution, basically we've seen fluvial valleys. And in green here, I'm indicating mapped alluvial bands also found at a broad range of latitudes. And of course, the Huygens Slender touched down where this red arrow is here, kind of in the middle, and it landed on a dry riverbed around that red cross, revealing rounded, light-toned, it's over there, the screen is so big I can't even see it. These light-toned, rounded cobbles, possibly made of ice, and fine, darker, probably less than 2 millimeter in diameter grains made of what we think are organics. And then finally, there are extensive dune fields surrounding Titan's equatorial regions, shown here in orange in this map. Now, from the morphology of the dunes, sand transport directions were mapped, and it was determined that even though sand is primarily concentrated around the equator, some of it gets redistributed from the equator outward towards the mid-latitudes, and the few aeolian features mapped at higher latitudes also show net transport towards the mid-latitudes. Oh, did I do this right? Yeah, okay. Now, in addition to lakes, rivers, and dunes, there are different types of terrains which were characterized by distinct morphologies in radar and spectral signatures that have been mapped. So some of these terrains have mysterious origins. For example, Titan's karst-like terrain, like here, and the widespread undifferentiated plains, this is what they look like in radar. So it just kind of looks like static on an old TV, right? Try to understand how this forms. We don't really understand the kinds of processes that shape these and how or whether they may be genetically related to any of the active sedimentary systems and environments that we see on Titan. Now, a dominant reservoir of sediment on Titan is, as I mentioned, the moon's equatorial dunes, which not only are thought to be active, but they are thought to have been so for tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And from the mechanics of windblown sand and the way that the sand hops on the surface or saltate, we know that sand should be relatively well sorted because it's much easier to saltate a 200 micron grain under Titan surface conditions than it is to saltate a finer dust grain or a coarser, say, a pebble. And based on wind tunnel experiments and models, we think that Titan's dunes are likely made of 200 to 300 micron grains. So where does all of that sand formed in this very specific size range form on Titan? Several mechanisms have been proposed to create sand-sized materials on Titan, and they're illustrated here with a figure made by Barnes et al. in 2015, starting with flocculation of very fine grains here into coarser aggregates when they are transported by a liquid. Next, we have weathering of an evaporated crust that would be this one here, that precipitated after some liquid evaporated, forming sand-sized grains. Then we get sintering, whereby small grains coalesce into larger ones over time through largely diffusive processes. And then finally, lithification and subsequent weathering and erosion into sand-sized materials. Now you can see that all of these processes require the presence of fine micron-scale particles to start. And these are largely thought to be derived high up in the atmosphere from photochemistry, producing an organic haze from methane that generates fine-grained hydrocarbon compounds that would then rain down onto the surface of Titan. Now on Earth and Mars, sand can be blown around by winds for very long distances and over very long times because grains are mechanically strong. But on Titan, the picture might be somewhat different. Specifically, the organics that are thought to make up the sand, which are simple organics and hydrocarbons analog to what we call tholins on Earth, they are mechanically weak. So here, for example, you can see that the Young's modulus of tholins is about an order of magnitude lower than that of silicate grains. So this finding led the authors of this study, Xinting Yu and co-authors in 2018, to hypothesize that sand must be derived locally close to the equatorial region because the grains are too soft and too brittle to be transported over long distances. Now, although this hypothesis cannot be ruled out, it's unclear why sources of sand would concentrate around the equator. when organics should be produced anywhere in the atmosphere through photochemistry. So here I'd like to explore an alternative hypothesis that would allow for sand-sized particles to be produced anywhere on Titan and allow them to survive long transport distances, and also, ideally, bonus, a mechanism that could explain the distribution of Titan's terrain types and landscapes. And this is where ooids come into play. Okay, so what do ooids have to do with Titan? And I guess the first question we need to address is, what are ooids? So ooids are these spheroidal, largely calcium carbonate grains, which you can see in the picture up here. This is my friend Kirsten Seebach's hand for scale. And these form on Earth in shallow tropical seas. The ooids in that picture are from Turks and Caicos, southeast of the Bahamas. Now, ooids almost look like beads, and if you were to cut them in half, this is what you would see out here. You would see a nucleus, typically a detrital sand grains, around which several concentric layers of calcium carbonate have developed. And that grain structure is thought to arise from the competing constructive and destructive effects of calcium carbonate precipitation on the one hand, and when the grains are at rest, and abrasion when the grains are being transported, for example, in high energy shoals. So here we'll test the hypothesis that sand on Titan is not necessarily generated only near the equator, but constantly regenerates through episodic abrasion when grains are transported, and sintering when they are at rest, in a process that is analogous to the formation of ooids in Earth's shallow carbonate seas. So under this mechanism, grains are entrained and transported either by methane rivers or nitrogen-rich winds. And as they get transported, they also abrade upon collisions, which will tend to decrease their size through time. But when the grains are not transported, they might sinter and coarsen through time. And this part of the process is, again, a little bit different from ooid formation. We're not envisioning the grains to grow through precipitation here, but rather through a diffusion-controlled coalescence of these small grains into larger ones over time. And as grains episodically sinter while at rest and abrade while in transport, this process will conspire to produce a sustained supply of sand-sized material that maintain an equilibrium grain size. So let's test it quantitatively. So the mathematical framework for our working hypothesis is relatively simple, and it states that the grain size is set by the sum of this abrasion term here, and this is a sintering term, and I here is an intermittency factor, which is a measure of how frequent transport events are. So when you do have transport, you get abrasion, and when you don't have transport, you get sintering. And we'll consider the case of abrasion in both fluvial and aeolian environments, as both are known to occur at a wide range of latitudes on Titan. Okay, so combining these instantaneous rates with transport intermittencies, you can start making predictions of what transport intermittencies are required, so shown on the y-axis here, to produce an equilibrium grain size of a given value, which is shown on the x-axis. And I did this for transport occurring 100% of the time by winds, that will be the orange curve, and transport occurring 100% of the time in river flow here, this will be the blue curve. Now, from global circulation models and observations from the Cassini spacecraft, the relative frequencies of winds and overland flows that could transport sand can be very roughly, crudely constrained to be 1 to 10% of the time, with the proportion at which transport could occur by winds rather than liquid flows varying with latitude. So near the equator, virtually all transport occurs in an aeolian environment, so by winds, whereas the frequency of fluvial flows that are capable of transporting sediments increases as you move towards the poles. Now, adding our climate constraints here, we can start making predictions of what the equilibrium grain size would be for these climate conditions on Titan. And we predict that through this process of episodic sintering and abrasion, we would form sand in the 150 to 300 micron size range near the equator, and about 200 to 400 micron near the poles where fluvial transport is a little bit more dominant. So what could this all mean for Titan's sedimentary cycle? So we showed that a continuous supply of sand-sized materials could exist at equatorial and high latitudes where winds or flows are capable to transport sand and are relatively frequent. And we've shown that intermittent transport and sintering can lead to the formation of these perfectly sized saltatable sand grains near the equator where the dunes are. Coincidence? Who knows? And perhaps slightly coarser near the poles. And we also know that some sediments produced at high and low latitudes are transported towards the mid-latitudes. And as ground moisture increases from the equator towards the poles, transport by winds becomes less efficient despite relatively frequent winds, which possibly creates a lull in the frequency of transport at these mid-latitudes here. And so sediment that would accumulate at mid-latitudes wouldn't be transported as frequently, which means under our model that they get more time to sinter through time, forming coarser and coarser grains and possibly even experience diagenesis. So this mechanism could explain the formation potentially of Titan's undifferentiated plains here in green, which again are everywhere around the mid-latitudes. And that scenario is consistent with some spectral observations that we have that suggest a possible organic composition for at least large swaths of the undifferentiated plains. Now, coarser organic sand grains produced at high latitudes could also eventually get deposited into terminal basins like lakes. And in the presence of soluble cements, diagenesis could also occur, turning these sandy deposits into widespread organic sandstones, which has been proposed by Mike Malaska and co-authors in 2020, and in turn could be responsible for the formation of Titan's karst-like labyrinth terrain, which here is shown in magenta at high latitudes. Okay, so now there's significant uncertainty. This is merely a hypothesis, of course, and a lot of the uncertainty that we have comes from the fact that we essentially know nothing about the materials that actually make up sand on Titan and their mechanical properties. So that leaves some pretty fundamental questions open, like, again, what is Titan sand made of? How does it form in the first place? And can these materials sinter at the surface, right? Here, sintering is a pretty critical piece of that model. We don't even know if materials at Titan's surface temperatures can actually sinter. A PhD student in my group, Colin Marvin, ASU alum, is currently getting at some of these questions by analyzing the patterns formed by dune crest lines globally on Titan. And especially he's looking at the spatial density of defects in those patterns and what they tell us about changes in boundary conditions. And we're hoping that this approach will help us identify, for example, sources of windblown sand or places where sand becomes less prone to aeolian transport. And spoiler alert, the paper was actually submitted, and we do find that dune defects actually suggest that sand is transported all around the equator over 11,000 kilometers, suggesting indeed that either we're wrong about the mechanical properties of Titan sand, or there is some mechanism like sintering that could constantly regenerate the grains as they abrade during transport. Okay, so briefly summing up this first part, inspired by the mechanics of Uid formation, we showed based on our current understanding of possible sediment materials on Titan that episodic abrasion and sintering of organic sand driven by Titan seasons could explain the distribution of Titan's landscapes. Okay, so next, I will take you back to the inner solar system and we'll think about formation of rivers in landscapes that are devoid of plant life and what it means for the landscapes of both the early Earth, but also Mars. And this work was conducted primarily in collaboration with Alessandro Yelpi at UBC, a PhD student of mine, Michael Hassan, and more recently, collaborator in Italy, Alvise Finotella. So on Earth, we know that vegetation affects rivers, fluvial systems, the way they function, and the way they get recorded into rocks. And notably, sedimentologists have noticed a dramatic shift in the architecture of fluvial deposits throughout the Paleozoic era. Now, fluvial deposits that predate the Silurian to Devonian period around here typically consist of laterally extensive, relatively thin, but massive sandstone without significant amounts of mud or floodplain mudstone. And in contrast, if you look at fluvial deposits that post-date the Silurian and Devonian periods, a lot more mud rocks start appearing in the sedimentary record next to these fluvial sandy deposits. And fluvial deposits start displaying what we clear channel bodies. You can start seeing channels. Now this is tilted here because of tectonics, but you can see a channel. A lot more mud, especially floodplain deposits, as well as what we call heterolithic lateral accretion sets, which is a mouthful for just inclined layers of alternated sandy and muddy beds. And to date, these heterolithic lateral accretion sets have been used as a diagnostic indicator of river meandering. And as a result, this transition that we see in the rock record was interpreted as a revolution in the planform geometry of rivers. Now, let's think about why that might have happened. So before the Silurian and Devonian period, we would have had mostly wide braided streams like this one. Here, this is a picture from Iceland. And after the Silurian and Devonian period, we start seeing what we interpret as point bar deposits, which would be indicative of meander migration. And both scenarios have dramatically different implications for recycling of organics and sediment in floodplains, which in turn affect biogeochemical cycles and climate. And so we have reasons to actually care about this. So the thing that's interesting about this transition is that the fuzzy boundary where meandering rivers seem to appear in the rock record roughly coincides with the advent and diversification of land plants, going from the rise of land plants to the appearance of roots and leaves and seeds, all the way to the appearance of trees. And in addition, many scientists have attempted to make rivers meander in the lab, in flumes, and to date, few have succeeded. But those who did succeed did so by seeding their flume with alfalfa sprout. And so because of all of these observations and experimental results, some went as far as saying that plants are required for rivers to meander, and that could explain the transition that we see in the rock record. Now, something doesn't sit quite right with this hypothesis. If we look at Mars, which most realistically never hosted anything as complex as a land plant, I'm not saying no life, just no land plants, we see this. So you can start seeing this ridge here that kind of snake around the terrain. And if I guide your eye, you might even start seeing abandoned loops and what one might be tempted to call a scroll bar. Yeah, these are clear deposits of meandering rivers. Again, we see not only the sinuous channels, but also which are or remnants of amalgamated channels, but we also see evidence for lateral migration in the form of scroll bars and abandoned meander loops. So here I'll briefly show you how we have started testing 3 hypotheses regarding the formation of meandering rivers in unvegetated landscapes. And those 3 hypotheses are: 1, that plants made meandering possible; 2, plants affected the shape and dynamics of meanders; and 3, plants affect the deposits of meandering rivers. The first hypothesis, again, is that plants made meandering possible, or a corollary to the hypothesis is that meandering is not possible without plants. So here I'm showing a drone picture of the Amargosa River in Death Valley. And as you can tell, it doesn't bode well for hypothesis number 1. Here's another drone picture taken. This is the Columbus Basin in Nevada, in which you can see beautiful meanders, point bars, even a beautiful meander cutoff. So until fairly recently, modern unvegetated meandering rivers had virtually gone unnoticed. And that's because they are few and they are located in remote and arid basins, right? If you think about places where there's no vegetation on Earth today, well, there aren't many. Vegetation has been really good at adapting to most environments. And so it took us a while, and certainly took the advent of high-resolution satellite imagery to start noticing how frequent those systems actually are in remote places. So today we have visited a little over a handful of unvegetated meandering streams in the Western United States. And although I don't really have the time to expand on this point because I have a lot of other cool stuff to discuss, we did develop a conceptual physics-based model for the formation of single-thread meandering rivers in unvegetated substrates, mud-rich substrates, and showed that these meandering rivers may indeed really form in places where there's no vegetation, as long as there's mud to provide cohesion to the banks. And that is consistent with all of our field observations in all of these places. So I took a bit of a shortcut here, but are plants needed for rivers to meander? I hope that at least the drone photos convinced you that the answer is no, and that mud in riverbanks can provide sufficient strength for flow to stay confined within well-defined single thread channel. And that implies that meandering rivers should have existed before plants. We just don't really know how to recognize them in the rock record. So that's a problem for the way we've interpreted about 90% of Earth's history, but it's also a big problem when we go to places like Mars. So next, we tested hypothesis number 2, which is that plants affect the shape and dynamics of meanders. And to do that, this was more of a remote sensing approach. We compiled the morphometrics of meandering rivers across the globe in both vegetated and unvegetated landscapes, spanning all climate zones but polar, and a wide range of tectonic settings. So starting with shape, and specifically the width to depth ratio of rivers, because that ratio is thought to be a very important control in whether rivers meander or not. And so here I'm just plotting channel depth as a function of channel width. In blue, you have data for unvegetated streams. In green, you have vegetated streams. And by and large, the trend is very similar. There's no clear difference between the width-depth ratio of meandering rivers, whether there's vegetation or not. And we also looked at the sinuosity of meander bands, and there again, we didn't detect significant differences. So next, we measured and compiled the lateral migration rate of both vegetated and unvegetated rivers from historical satellite images. And here the story is actually very different. So although both vegetated and unvegetated rivers display a clear correlation between their rate of lateral migration here on the y-axis and channel width here on the x-axis, you might notice that unvegetated meandering rivers shown in blue for any given channel width migrate about 10 times faster. It's closer to 8, but we say 10 because it sounds better, than vegetated streams. It migrates a lot faster. We'll talk about the implications of that in a minute. And finally, the third hypothesis that we wanted to test is whether plants affect the deposits of meandering rivers. Here's a picture of my collaborator, Alessandro Yelpi, in one of, I believe this is McCloud Springs Wash in Nevada, one of the trenches that we dug to look at the deposits. And specifically, we wanted to see whether we could identify any significant differences with the deposits of vegetated meandering rivers. So to do that, we've conducted a set of field investigations where, again, we've dug trenches. This one was Shoshone Creek in Nevada. You can see, I believe this is Colin Marvin, again, ASU alum here for scale, and myself. And in addition to trenching, we also flew a drone to get a better sense of what the floodplain and its looks like and its organization. And it's just baffling. It's beautiful. You can see all of these abandoned meander loops everywhere. It's like the entire floodplain is actually made of old channel elements, right? Because those streams are so laterally mobile. Okay, so I won't nerd out too much about detailed sedimentology with here. But putting it together, our observations allowed us to put together a stratigraphic model for the deposits of unvegetated meandering rivers. And in brief, the stratigraphic model is a lot more reminiscent to a sandy braided river than it is to the deposits of modern meandering rivers. So let me say that again. when you don't have vegetation, the deposits of meandering rivers look like the deposits of braided rivers when you do have vegetation. Okay. So then, to briefly summarize again, no significant effect on geometry, but the channels migrate laterally much faster. And if the channels migrate laterally much faster, then the channel deposits are going to be much more laterally continuous, perhaps thinner, and they're going to start looking like the deposits of braided rivers. And this is, to us, saying that most likely a lot of what was interpreted as a transition from sandy braided rivers to meandering rivers is in fact simply just a signature of the effect of vegetation on the way that rivers record their dynamics into rocks. We had meandering rivers before, we just didn't know how to recognize them. We were using the wrong criteria to recognize them in the rock record. So this, of course, has profound implications for the way we approach paleohydrology on the early Earth, but also perhaps most importantly on Mars. Now, because there's no plate tectonics on Mars, the remnants of billion-year-old meandering streams, some of the earliest sedimentary records that we have in the solar system, have been preserved. And so in that sense, Mars could provide a unique snapshot of how Earth's early surface behaved and early meandering rivers behaved. So back in February 2021, the Perseverance rover landed at Jezero Crater on Mars, where an ancient river once flowed into a lake and formed what we used to call a delta. Now there's debate around that. But on top of, I'll keep calling it delta just so that to have a word to describe what we're looking at, we can call it a fan. A fan is maybe a more generic word. On top of the fan, you can see sinuous ridges that look like the deposits of meandering rivers at the top of the fan. So here I'm showing some of the very first observations of the fan deposits that were made by the Perseverance rover. There's been a lot more since then. But I will just say that our findings about the deposits of unvegetated meanders have implications for the distribution of fine-grained sequences in the fluvial deposits within the delta. So clays. And that in turn is particularly important because mudstones are thought to be good at preserving organics and make for very desirable astrobiological targets. So I'm very excited to see what the samples tell us once they come back, because they will come back. And I really anticipate that these deposits will teach us a lot about how to interpret the Earth's pre-vegetation fluvial record once we get a close look. So wrapping up this example with a couple of open questions, we've determined that meandering rivers existed before plants. We still don't know how common they were. We also don't know how much of Earth's record was misinterpreted. And finally, one point that I didn't discuss too much, but that might be a caveat to our modern analogs, is that we find them in arid basins where discharge variability is very important, and that might also affect the deposits potentially. So how does aridity actually influence the geometry of the deposits? That is a shortcoming of analog fieldwork on Earth, unfortunately. And PhD students in my group, Michael Hassan and Colin Marvin, are currently tackling some of these questions, both by refining our understanding of the differences in dynamics between vegetated and unvegetated meanders and their deposits, but also by developing new, more robust tools to interpret the positional environments from microscopic scratches and pits and grooves imparted onto individual sand grains during transport. In fact, one of those papers was just published in PNAS. You should check it out. Now, despite these open questions, it's clear that Earth's pre-vegetation fluvial record is likely much more similar to Mars's than to the modern terrestrial fluvial record. And unfortunately, most of that record on Earth was lost to plate tectonics or altered by metamorphism, deformation, whereas it's still sitting at the surface of Mars in a near pristine state. So exploring Mars can really teach us about Earth's past in ways that Earth simply cannot anymore. So Finally, we are going to stay on Mars for my third and last vignette, and I will tell you about how an observation that we made on another planet, Mars, taught us about a fundamental geological process, that of the formation of sand ripples formed by winds. And this work is the result of discussions and collaboration with several people. I'll highlight here Ryan Ewing, previously at Texas A&M, now at NASA JSC, a postdoc in my group, Carlos Alvarez, as well as other collaborators who've helped with this project. So when one thinks of a sandy desert on Earth, the top picture here is kind of the mental image that they build in their mind. Large dunes, mantled by small decimeter scale ripples. Now on Mars, this is what we see here at the bottom. And so this whole pile of dark material is a sand dune made of basaltic sand. That's why it's dark. The image, by the way, is taken from a mosaic from the mass camera on board NASA's Curiosity rover in Gale Crater. And so here I'm showing you, they're not true histograms, but they're plots showing the modes of bed form wavelength or crest-to-crest spacing on both planets. So again, on Earth, you see our decimeter scale ripples here, that's this peak. And then you see our decameter to 100-meter scale, up to kilometer scale dunes. Okay, on Mars, you have the same peak here for the dunes. That's the big dark pile of sand. We also see decimeter scale ripples. It's gonna be hard to do with the pointer, but these smaller features here. But then there's a third mode of bed forms here, you see in the histogram, with wavelengths or crest-to-crest spacings of about a meter. So again, these are the impact ripples. Sorry, the small ripples. These are the large dunes. This is a satellite view from Mars. So a top-down view of an entire dune. But then we have this intermediate size of bed forms on Mars that have wavelengths of 1 to 3 meters that are nowhere to be found on Earth. So what are these? It's important to note that there are real gaps in bed form wavelength around 20 to 80 centimeters. And then again, between 20 and about 80 meters on Mars, completely separating what I'll be calling the large Martian ripples, so that intermediate size, from other bed form types. They're distinct from the small ripples and from the larger dunes. Now, in addition to having different sizes, they also look different from any other bed form. They can have sinuous crests. They are asymmetric, and they almost look like breaking waves on the ocean surface, right? With these shallow upwind slopes and steeper near angle of repose downwind faces or slip faces. And they are often associated with what we call grain fall deposits. They're these smooth blankets of grains that settle out of suspension past a ripple crest. And these grain flow deposits here, which are just little avalanche deposits. So how do large Martian ripples form? That's the million-dollar question. Well, on Earth, the formation of alien ripples is thought to be intimately tied to saltation, or again, the hopping of sand grains at the surface through an impact mechanism. So you can imagine that if you have wind blowing here from left to right, and you have a bump in the sand bed, grains are hopping around, and the grains that are resting on the upwind face of that bump will be preferentially exposed to being impacted by incoming grains. So they will be preferentially splashed into saltation. Whereas the grains that are resting in what we call the shadow zone, right? They're protected by that bump. They will experience a lower frequency of impacts from incoming grains. They will be protected from impacts. And so that will result in preferential erosion or transport of the grains sitting on the upwind face, and preferential deposition of sand grains on the downwind face. And that together leads to the growth and migration of these so-called impact ripples. So before we knew that small ripples coexisted with the large ones on Mars, it was thought that perhaps the lower gravity on Mars and atmospheric pressure led to longer saltation trajectories, which perhaps could generate larger impact ripples on Mars, like those that we can actually see from orbit, not the small ones. However, this single mechanism cannot explain the co-occurrence of both scales of bed forms within a single grain size, within uniformly distributed sand. So another possibility then is that the large Martian ripples are coarse-grained ripples, such as those observed, for example, by the Spirit rover at El Dorado, up here in the top right, or the Curiosity rover itself in sand sheets outside of the Bagnall Dune field. Now, both of these hypotheses, that large Martian ripples are impact ripples forming in bimodal sand, or that they are coarse-grained ripples, both of these require the presence of a coarse-grained population, right? Like, for example, here at El Dorado, you can see these clearly much coarser grains. These have diameters up to 2 millimeters compared to a couple hundred micron for the darker sand here. Same here on in Gale Crater, you can see clear color differences between the crests and the troughs. That's a photometric effect. It's also related to the fact that they have slightly different mineralogy, but the grains are coarser at the crest than they are in the troughs. So to test that hypothesis, that that's also the case in the dunes, we took a closer look at sand grains using the MALI instrument, which is the microscopic imager on board Curiosity. This is Curiosity here taking a selfie in front of a dune, and you can also see the crater rim here in the top left, and in the top right, you can see the tip of Mount Sharp, which is the crater central mound. And so wherever we saw small ripples migrating on top of large ripples, which themselves piggyback onto dunes, we found that the sand that makes up these bed forms is unimodally distributed and relatively fine. So grain size is around 100 to 200 micron. So we don't think that the large Martian ripples are either impact ripples forming in bimodally distributed sand or coarse-grained ripples. Now there's another type of bed form that I haven't talked about yet, that those large Martian ripples do resemble, but those are not formed by winds. They're formed by water on Earth's riverbeds instead. So you can see here a set of current ripples that formed on top of fluvial bars. And just like our large Martian ripples, they are asymmetric, they are sinuous, and in water on Earth, they form with crest-to-crest spacings or wavelengths of about 12 centimeters, and they're distinct from what we call fluvial dunes. So you can see here about 12 centimeters, and they're distinct from fluvial dunes, which form with meter scale wavelength, can get much bigger. And in contrast to the impact ripples formed by the winds, current ripples actually form from a completely different mechanism. They form from a hydrodynamic instability. And as water accelerates, so here again, I have my little cartoon with flow from left to right. You have bumps in the bed. And as water accelerates upstream of a bump on the bed going upslope because of flow contraction, fluid drag causes entrainment of grains and thus erosion, while flow deceleration past the bed form causes sediment deposition, which ultimately, again, we have the same pattern of erosion and deposition leading to the growth and migration of these current ripples. A terrible slide to pause because there's math on it. Sorry about that. So to investigate our potential fluid drag origin for the equilibrium size of large Martian ripples, we performed a dimensional analysis. So thinking about parameters that govern sand transport here, we have, what do we have? We have grain size, D, RG is the buoyant weight of the grain specific submerged density times gravity. U star is the shear velocity of the flow. So you can think of it as the velocity of the flow very close to the bed. It's related to the stress imparted onto the bed. And nu here is kinematic viscosity. It's what you typically think of when you think of viscosity divided by the density of the flow. And that kinematic viscosity divided by the shear velocity of the flow that has the dimensions of a length, and that scales with the thickness of what we call the laminar sublayer close to the bed where flow is laminar. So based on the number of parameters and their dimensions, one can show that the problem can be recast in terms of 3 dimensionless quantities only. And in fact, Yalin, back in 1985, hydraulic engineer, showed experimentally that the problem can be further collapses to only 2 dimensionless quantities. So the first one that we chose is just a dimensionless wavelength. So lambda is the size or the wavelength crest-to-crest spacing of a bed form. And we normalize that by that length scale that I talked about, the thickness of the viscous sublayer. So the ratio of kinematic viscosity to shear velocity. You can also think of it, for those of you who think about fluid dynamics, of this number as a Reynolds number, where the length scale is taken as a ripple scale. So it's a ripple scale Reynolds number. And the second number that we chose, we call the Yalin number, which can be written as a Reynolds number and a Shields number, which you can also recast in terms of a Reynolds number, where the length scale is called the saturation length, which varies with the mode of transport. If you have fluvial transport, the mode of transport will be potentially more bed load, whereas in aeolian systems, it will be siltation. So that formulation for Alsat here can be different depending on the mode of transport. But essentially, we think this number encapsulates details of sediment transport. Okay. So here I'm plotting our dimensionless wavelength on the y-axis and our Yalin number here on the x-axis. And I started by plotting data for current ripples, so subaqueous ripples that form on Earth. And you can see that they tend to cluster along this line here, but we're in log-log space, so it's a power law of exponent 1/3. And I'm going to build this plot by adding different types of bed forms on there. First, I'm adding the small Martian ripples and Martian dunes. And as expected, we know that these don't form from this hydrodynamic instability, and so they don't fall onto that same power law relationship. But how surprising, the size of large Martian ripples seems to be fairly well predicted by that same scaling relationship, which supports our interpretation that the equilibrium size of those large Martian ripples is set by a hydrodynamic mechanism instead, as opposed to the same impact mechanism. So here we're plotting similar data, but in dimensional space now. So we have bed form size on the y-axis and atmospheric density on the x-axis. Now, because Mars's atmosphere is so thin and we have so much topography or so much relief on Mars, even just on Mars today, we actually sample a wide range of atmospheric densities. And so we're able to see on Mars today at just time t, how ripples forming at different elevations, thus different atmospheric densities, actually follow that same scaling relationship with atmospheric density. And another key observation is that a similar relationship is observed for Mars's smallest dunes. And that's actually a prediction that we make from hydrodynamic bed form formation theory, that underwater you can form ripples and dunes, right? And they're separated by a gap in bed form wavelength. So here in the gray shaded area, I plotted prediction from hydrodynamic bed form theory, but plugging in numbers for transport by winds on Mars. And you predict exactly that the gap that we observe between large ripples and dunes on Mars. Now, this is really cool because one can imagine that if those ripples get fossilized, right, or sedimentology, you start building cross stratification where you can see ripple migration in rocks and whatnot, it may be possible to use those ripples as a proxy for paleoatmospheric density, right? Because their size scales with density. So in order to use ripples as proxy for paleoclimate, we need to understand how sediment translates into sedimentary structures in the rock record, in particular, in this case, for bed forms that we don't really have on Earth. So what we can do for that is model it. Let me remove this. Okay. So thinking about what controls the geometry of preserved cross stratification, well, it's going to be a function of, one, the geometry of the different scales of bed forms that you have, their relative scales, their relative migration direction, the relative rate of bed form migration to vertical bed aggradation rate. And so here I'm just showing one example of what the deposits might look like if you have a population of, I'm going to pause it now because it's going to start looking weird. Anyways, we can start again. So in this example here, we have a population of sinuous bed forms migrating on top of a bigger bed form. So say large ripples on top of a dune. And you can see that you would form these trough-shaped, lenticular-shaped sets of layers, perpendicular or roughly perpendicular to the migration direction. These lenticular shapes here, those we call trough. This is trough cross certification, and these we don't typically see in aeolian deposits on Earth at small scales. We see it formed by large dunes, but not by small ripples. We see it formed by fluvial ripples, though. So if we see those in rocks that we can convince ourselves formed in an aeolian environment on Mars, then we can start using that stratification to reconstruct the size of the bed forms and then reconstruct the density of the atmosphere. And so, because the thickness of those troughs, so here is an example of what your outcrop might look like after erosion and everything. I'll show you an actual picture in one slide. But so, because the thickness of the troughs scales with the height of the bed forms, which itself scales with the wavelength of the bed forms, which we showed scales with atmospheric density, then we can go from one to the other. And in fact, we did find preserved stratification from ancient large wind ripples on Mars. This is an example here from within the Burns Formation at Victoria Crater. That picture was taken by yet another rover. This was Opportunity back in 2005, I believe. And based on the thickness of the trough cross sets that we observed in this location, we inferred a range of wavelengths that is here given by the height of that red or orange box. And when combined to our scaling relationship, that's the black line here, we determine that Mars' atmosphere at the time of deposition, about 3.7 billion years ago, was pretty much modern-like. That's a pretty surprising result. It supports the idea of a thin atmosphere at the time of deposition of the Burns Formation sandstone. And this has pretty cool implications for our understanding of early Mars climate. So this last example was an instance where surprising observations from Mars challenged our understanding of one of the most fundamental sedimentary structures that there is, sand ripples. And this really illustrates how exploring other planets might allow us to probe unexplored parameter spaces and refine our models for geological processes. And in doing so, it really opened a whole new set of questions. For example, much is still to be done to understand the transport conditions under which large hydrodynamic ripples can form on Mars. So to tackle this question, a postdoc in my group, Carlos Alvarez, has been running experiments in the NASA Ames wind tunnel, low pressure wind tunnel, to recreate ripples. Again, spoiler alert, the paper is in review, but we were able to actually form large Martian ripples at a range of atmospheric pressures between that of Earth and that of Mars. They're the green symbols here. And their size is well predicted by hydrodynamic ripple theory and all of that. And we're able to make observations about, like detailed observations about transport of sand and really refine our models for their formation. So stay tuned for that. We also observed large aeolian ripples that are stratigraphically bounded by fluvial lacustrine deposits at Gale Crater. So that's actually pretty crazy, because if you think about it, we first had a period when you could have water at the surface of Mars. Then the atmosphere was thin enough for these large ripples to form. And then you had water again, right? How can that happen? Because water is not stable if you have an atmosphere like 2 days, right? So this suggests that there might have been periods of atmospheric collapse followed by aqueous episodes, really offering unique insights into Mars's transition from a wet planet to the cold and arid desert it is today. So through this high-level sample platter of our work, I hope to have convinced you that a lot remains to be learned about the mechanics of planetary surface processes, and that doing so will require a two-way dialogue between the Earth and planetary sciences. So first, just summarizing the main results, drawing a comparison between the formation of calcium carbonate ooids on Earth and hydrocarbon sand on Titan allowed us to build a self-consistent mechanistic model for Titan's sedimentary cycle in response to the moon's climate that is capable of explaining the distribution of Titan's landscapes, to be tested by Dragonfly when we get a lot more information about what the sand is actually made of. Second, we showed that the study of the early Earth, and in particular Earth before the advent of macroscopic life on land, could benefit from the exploration of ancient Martian sedimentary deposits. And finally, by providing a full-scale experiment in which sandy deserts form under a low-density atmosphere, Mars revolutionized really the way geoscientists think about one of the most fundamental landforms that there is, and that's sand ripples. So to conclude, quantitative models for surface processes that we develop from observations on Earth can be applied, of course, to other planets to learn about their hydrology, climate, environments, habitability, you call it. And in turn, the diversity of these planets and planetary bodies in our solar system offers a wealth of new data, most of which is untapped, that when you look at it, often challenges our understanding of geological processes. And it's really this dialogue between the Earth and planetary sciences that, in my opinion, offers one of the most exciting and promising avenues to decipher the history of solid bodies in the solar system. And yeah, with that, I will take any questions. We don't have much time for questions.
We have a question online. Do you see bed forms on Titan that appear to show similarity to Mars?
So on Titan, we see the dunes, as I mentioned, those big linear dunes around the equator. Sadly, the resolution of the data we have, mostly Cassini radar data, does not allow us to see smaller scale features. And so the bed forms that we see, the dunes that we see on Titan, are mostly 1.5 kilometers and bigger in spacing. People have tried to look at whether you could have detect smaller bed forms based on how the radar is scattered, depending on the direction that you look at the surface. Inconclusive. People have formed bed forms in the Titan wind tunnel, but this is TBD because the Titan wind tunnel has a cross-section this big. So of course, the bed forms that are going to form in there are going to be small. So, they predict small bed forms, but that's to be expected. And then with Huygens, where we landed, we didn't see any alien bed forms at smaller scale, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. So TBD. Again, there's a lot to be learned about the properties of sand on Titan. A big one that would determine the stability of smaller scale bed forms is cohesion. So if grains stick together, it will make it harder for these smaller bed forms to form. But we don't know if there's any cohesion in Titan materials, sediments.
So the vegetation story for meandering is really interesting. One of the things that one of your plots showed is that the unvegetated meandering streams, rivers, are like a factor of 10, they're order of magnitude smaller in, what was it, width that you were showing? Or and so is there a relationship between vegetation and the scale of these meandering rivers? And it feels like potentially chicken and egg, because are the meandering rivers bigger in wetter places because there's vegetation in wetter places versus drier? So.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a great question. It's a question that we also have. This is another one of the drawbacks of analog field work. On modern Earth today, we are constrained by the size of the drainage basins that can form unvegetated rivers. Unvegetated meandering rivers. So because of our current, the way that the continents are currently arranged, endorheic basins, which are mostly where we find these streams where there's no vegetation, are small. So you don't drain large enough areas to have, to gather a lot of discharge and concentrate it. Now, that could be a coincidence, or that could also be the cause for it, right? Well, you could also argue that perhaps mud can provide some cohesion and allow you to form smaller scale meandering rivers, but perhaps larger streams, would impart too much stress onto the banks, and you couldn't form larger rivers if all you have is mud. We don't know. But what we know, though, is that we do see very large scale meandering rivers or meandering river systems on Mars.
That was a great talk, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Almost too much to think about. That's a great swath of things you've covered. Well, so one of the really interesting and sort of scary things you showed was that there's been misinterpretations of our record here on Earth because of assumptions we made or misunderstandings we had of the complete picture. You've also then showed the detail of something, I think, if you saw trough cross stratification, you would think, that has to be an aqueous environment. And you've shown that's not true because of the conditions are different, right? You've got a beautiful scaling relation. My main question I was going to ask you is, you could test this, and you've already done that, so that's great. But does that mean, are there worries that things that we have taken as indicators of that's an aqueous environment, a fluvial environment, or a lake environment on Mars, and might not be?
On Mars and on Earth. So this is something I didn't talk about, but the next natural step to the third vignette I told you about, the large ripples, is to apply it back to Earth. So if you think about the Archean Earth, we don't really know how thick the Archean Earth was. We have very few constraints on what the total pressure of the atmosphere was. We have some idea of what the concentration of reactive species was, O2, CO2, but nitrogen, not so much. And it's possible, at least there's a few lines of evidence that suggest that Earth's atmosphere was a little bit thinner. And if that's the case, then you could have formed aeolian ripples that would look like subaqueous ripples on the early Earth. It also just happens that there's this big mystery in Archean sedimentology of why do we have so few aeolian deposits in the Archean and in relative to fluvial ones. So could we have misinterpreted that? Maybe. That's actually a project that a new graduate student in my group is tackling. We just started doing field work in South Africa, looking at Archean aeolian deposits. We'll look into that.
Sorry for jumping in, but it's been pointed out to me that in our enthusiasm, we have overrun the official time for Colloquium. So let's give our speaker one more formal hand of applause, please.
Yeah.
And if you are in person and you have any lingering questions, I encourage you to contact our speaker or simply try to get between him and the door.